Imagine an Inquisitor so feared, he needs no proof, only a confession. He takes the town's beloved healer, an innocent woman, and for 8 days in a dark cellar, he breaks her. Not with torture, but with words. He whispers her into madness until she confesses to his every fantasy, of flying on broomsticks and dancing with the devil. But on the day of her execution, as she stands broken at the pyre, he ignores her completely, points to the town's mayor, and uses her confession to accuse him of a greater heresy. She was never the target, she was just the key. In the year of our Lord 1233, on the very eve of the harvest, a stillness descended upon the town. It was a silence unlike any the oldest residents could recall, a heavy blanket that smothered all sound. This was not the simple quiet of night or the respectful hush of the Sabbath, it was an unnatural void, a deep and listening emptiness that had swallowed the world. Just days before, the air had been thick with the rhythms of life. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer provided a steady beat against the chatter of the market square. Children's laughter echoed in the narrow alleys, and the murmur of prayer from the church was a constant comfort. Now, the forge was cold, the market stall stood empty, and the only sound was the unbidden thumping of one's own heart within a cage of ribs. The animals had felt it first. The cattle stood motionless in the fields, their heads low, refusing to graze. In the evenings, no comforting lowing drifted back to the town as the herds were brought in. The town's ever-boisterous dogs, known for their territorial barking, had fallen silent. They lay with their tails tucked, whining softly behind bolted doors, refusing to venture even into familiar yards. It had all begun with the crows. For weeks, they had gathered in uncountable numbers, a swirling black vortex above the spire of the town hall. Their cawing was a relentless, grating chorus from dawn until dusk, a sound that frayed the nerves and soured the mood of all below. The sky itself seemed bruised by their presence, a living storm of feathers and noise that promised nothing good. Then, 3 days passed, the noise had ceased in a single, terrifying instant. The townsfolk who dared to look up saw not a retreat, but a fall. The birds simply folded their wings and dropped from the sky as one. There was no screeching, no struggle, just a soft, sickening percussion as thousands of small bodies rained down upon the rooftops and cobblestones below. The main square became a carpet of black. A thick, gruesome tapestry of broken wings, dull eyes, and deathly stillness was woven across the stones. People peered from behind their shutters, their hands flying to their mouths to stifle gasps of horror. The sight was so utterly wrong, so contrary to the laws of nature, that it felt like a page torn from a book of profane prophecy. A grim duty fell to the town's watchmen. With faces pale and movements stiff, they moved through the macabre scene with carts and shovels. The work took hours, the air growing thick with the scent of death mingling with the dust of the late summer. They worked in the oppressive silence, the scrape of their tools against the stone sounding like a desecration. Whispers began to fester in the quiet houses and the single, somber tavern that remained open. The townsfolk, crossing themselves with trembling hands, spoke of a terrible omen. Old superstitions, long dormant, were resurrected in hushed tones. They searched for a cause, a sin, a reason for God's apparent and sudden abandonment of their town. This silence was more than an absence of sound, it had become a presence in itself. It was a watchful entity, pressing in on the walls of their homes, listening at their keyholes. Every creak of a floorboard was an indictment, every shadow a potential accuser. Fear, once a fleeting emotion, had become the very air they breathed, thin and cold in their lungs. No one could have known that this profound and terrifying omen was not the disaster itself. The dead crows and the suffocating quiet were merely the heralds, the shadow cast long before the body. The true evil was still on the road, moving toward their gates at a slow, deliberate pace, its arrival as certain as the setting of the sun. At the close of the 3rd day after the crow fall, a new subject captured the town's fearful attention. It was not a sound, but a premonition, a disturbance sighted on the long, empty road that led from the east. A lone watcher on the town wall, his eyes raw from staring into the uneventful haze, saw it first. It was a smudge of dust, a minor imperfection against the horizon. Yet it moved with a purpose that the wind alone could not provide. He did not raise an alarm, for it was not an army. His gut, however, tightened into a cold knot. He simply watched as the smudge grew, slowly resolving itself into a more defined shape. Soon, others saw it too. Whispers spread from the wall down into the silent streets. People emerged from their homes not in a crowd, but as individuals, drawn by a morbid curiosity that warred with their instinct to hide. They stood in the mouths of alleys and in the shadows of doorways, watching the road. The shape became a covered wagon, a plain and unremarkable box of dark wood on wheels. It was drawn by a pair of horses, their coats so black they seemed to drink the afternoon light. The animals moved at a steady, unhurried pace, as if they had been traveling for an eternity and had an eternity yet to go. Flanking the wagon were two riders, mounted on horses of the same midnight hue. They sat impossibly straight in their saddles, clad in dark, severe clothing devoid of any insignia or color. Their faces were obscured by shadow and distance, making them seem less like men and more like extensions of their mounts. There was a profound lack of urgency to their approach. It was not the pace of merchants eager for a market, nor of soldiers with a message. It was the slow, inexorable advance of a tide, or of a storm front building in the distance. This deliberation was more terrifying than any charge could ever be. As the small procession drew closer to the town gates, the few farmers still lingering near their fields abandoned their work and fled. They did not run shouting, they moved with a panic quickness, casting frightened looks over their shoulders as if pursued by a phantom only they could see. The carriage proceeded without haste, its iron-rimmed wheels grinding a funereal rhythm on the cobblestones. The sound was unnervingly loud in the vacuum of silence, each turn an echoing pronouncement of its progress. It was a sound that scraped against the very soul of the town. People vanished from its path. Doors that were ajar were pulled shut and bolted from within. Mothers snatched children from the streets, their hands clamped over small mouths to stifle any cry. To be seen was to be judged, and no one felt righteous enough to withstand such a gaze. The procession did not deviate. It moved through the outer streets and made its way directly toward the heart of the town, the main square. It was the same square that had been buried under a blanket of dead crows only 72 hours before, and the memory stained the very stones. The wagon came to a stop directly before the great oak doors of the cathedral. The placement was precise, a clear statement of authority. The horses stamped once and then fell still, their breath pluming in the cooling air. The two riders dismounted in perfect, unnerving unison, holding the reins but making no further move. All eyes, hidden behind shutters and from shadowed windows, were fixed upon the simple wooden door of the carriage. The entire town seemed to be holding a collective breath, waiting for the revelation. The silence that had been a wait for days now became a sharp, pointed thing, poised to strike. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, the carriage door creaked open. A darkness pooled within its interior, a deeper shade than the afternoon shadows. A single, coarse sandaled foot appeared and found the step, followed by the hem of a rough, brown monastic robe. The men who emerged did so not with the stiffness of travel, but with a slow, deliberate fluidity. He was tall, far taller than most men, and possessed a severe thinness that spoke of denial and discipline. His body was a mere frame for the unwavering will it contained. His head was uncovered, his tonsured gray hair a stark crown around a pale scalp. A sparse, wispy beard of the same gray did little to soften a jawline that looked as if it had been hewn from granite. His face was a landscape of harsh conviction, all sharp angles and hollowed cheeks. It was a face that had forgotten how to smile, if it had ever known. It seemed not carved from flesh, but from unforgiving stone, weathered by internal storms far more violent than any in the natural world. It was the face of a man who had stared into the abyss and found it to his liking. And then there were his eyes. They were not the eyes of a man who saw the world, but of one who saw through it, into the sullied souls of all he surveyed. They were pale, the color of winter ice, yet a feverish, unwavering light burned deep within them. It was a light that offered no warmth, only judgment. He took a moment, his feet planted firmly on the cobblestones, and his gaze swept across the square. It was a slow, methodical survey. He did not seem to be looking for anyone in particular, but rather assessing the very fabric of the town, weighing the virtue of its stones and the piety of its air. Those who watched from the windows felt that gaze pass over their hiding places like a physical touch, cold and invasive. They flinched back from the openings, their hearts hammering against their ribs. It felt as though he knew every secret sin, every dark thought they had ever harbored. A name, carried on 1,000 fearful rumors that had outpaced his journey, began to form on the lips of the hidden townsfolk. It was a whisper that needed no sound to be heard, a shared dread that passed from one soul to the next. The name was a curse and a sentence in one. Conrad von Marburg. The name itself held a terrible power. The Papal Inquisitor. A man whose fervor was a fire that consumed all it touched. Stories of his progress through the German lands were told in hushed, terrified tones, tales of pyres that lit the night sky and confessions extracted by the sheer force of his presence. He was a man who saw heresy not as an act, but as a contagion that festered in the slightest doubt, the smallest deviation. Mercy, to him, was a form of corruption, a weakness that allowed the devil's work to flourish. He did not seek evidence, he sought the catharsis of admission, the purification of the flame. As he stood there, a predator sensing the fear of his prey, the gentle breeze that had been rustling the last leaves on the square's linden trees abruptly died. The air became utterly still and heavy, as if the sky itself was pressing down, suffocating the town. The entire square, the entire world it seemed, held its breath under the weight of his piercing, inhuman gaze. The silence before his arrival had been one of emptiness and dread. The silence now was one of absolute, rapt terror. The true plague had arrived. The following morning, the sun rose into a sky of pale, indifferent gray. It offered light but no warmth, its rays seeming to recoil from the town's oppressive stillness. People moved through the streets with the furtive, twitching motions of mice in a hawk's shadow. They were driven by necessity, a need to perform the motions of life, but their hearts were not in it. The cathedral bell rang for morning mass, its familiar chime now stripped of all comfort. It sounded less like a call to prayer and more like a summons. Attendance was not a question of faith but of survival. To be absent would be to be noticed, and to be noticed by Conrad von Marburg was to invite a scrutiny that no soul could withstand. The service was a hollow affair. The priest's hands trembled as he raised the host, his voice cracking on the Latin prayers. He spoke of sin and redemption, but his words were aimed not at the congregation, but at the tall, unmoving figure in the front pew. Conrad did not kneel or pray, he watched, his icy gaze a silent judgment upon the priest and all his flock. When the mass concluded, the usual quiet chatter of parishioners was absent. They filed out into the gray morning in a strained silence, their shoulders hunched. A collective, unspoken relief at escaping the cathedral's suffocating atmosphere was quickly replaced by the lingering dread of the Inquisitor's presence in their town. Conrad emerged last, his two dark riders materializing at his side as if summoned from the stone itself. He paused on the cathedral steps, his gaze sweeping over the market square, which was just beginning to stir with a fearful, muted activity. He did not return to his lodgings, his work, it seemed, was about to begin. He descended the steps and began to walk through the square. The already sparse crowd recoiled from his path, creating a wide, empty corridor before him. People flattened themselves against stall fronts, their eyes downcast, trying to make themselves small, invisible. The only sound was the scuff of his sandals on the stone. Near the center of the square was a stall laden with bunches of dried herbs and clay pots of salves. It was a small pocket of fragrance and color in the otherwise drab market, a place of healing and comfort. For generations, its remedies had soothed fevers and eased coughs. It was a place of gentle, earthly magic. Behind the stall stood Elsa, a widow in her middle years. Her face was lined with the cares of a hard life, but her eyes held a quiet kindness. Her hands, though stained with earth and herbs, moved with a practiced gentleness as she arranged bundles of chamomile and lavender. The entire town knew her, and most had cause to be grateful for her knowledge. Conrad stopped a few paces from her stall. He did not speak. One of his riders stepped forward and unrolled a small piece of parchment. He held it for the Inquisitor to see. Conrad's eyes scanned the few lines of script, his expression unchanging, as if he were merely confirming something he already knew to be true. A woman watched from a nearby window, her face pinched with a sour, righteous envy. She was the author of that script, her words born of a neighbor's petty jealousy over a garden that grew fuller, a cow that gave richer milk. She saw only malice in Elsa's skill, a pact with darkness in her quiet success. The Inquisitor's gaze lifted from the parchment and settled upon Elsa. It was not an accusation, it was a verdict already delivered. He raised a single, long finger and pointed. The gesture was simple, economical, and utterly devastating. It cut through the air and pinned Elsa in place like a butterfly to a board. Elsa looked up, her expression one of mild confusion. She thought perhaps he wished to buy something, though it was impossible to imagine this man suffering any common ailment. She followed the line of his pointed finger and realized it was aimed squarely at her own heart. The confusion on her face began to curdle into fear. One of the riders spoke, his voice loud and devoid of emotion, reading from a copy of the denunciation. The words fell like stones into the horrified silence of the square. It spoke of a woman who shunned company, who was seen whispering to her cat, a creature as black as sin. It spoke of her herbs, calling them not remedies, but witches' potions. The town guards, standing near the town hall, shifted uneasily. They knew Elsa. One of them had a son whose fever she had broken just last winter. They looked at each other, then at the Inquisitor. His cold gaze flickered toward them, and in it was a command more absolute than any king's. Their duty to their neighbor evaporated in the heat of their own fear. They moved forward, their steps heavy with reluctance. Elsa's eyes widened in disbelief and terror as they approached. She looked past them, searching the faces in the crowd, the people she had known her whole life. She saw no help there. She saw only fear, and in some eyes, a grim relief that it was she, and not they, who had been chosen. The guards took her arms. Their touch was meant to be firm, but it was rough with their own anxiety. A small, startled cry escaped Elsa's lips. One of the guards flinched, but the other's grip tightened. They began to pull her away from the stall, from the life she had known. In the commotion, a basket of dried lavender was knocked to the ground. The fragrant purple buds scattered across the grimy cobblestones, their gentle, calming scent a cruel mockery of the scene. A guard's boot crushed them, releasing a final, poignant puff of fragrance before they were ground into the dirt. Suddenly, a flash of movement. From beneath the stall, a cat emerged. It was as black as the horses that had pulled the wagon, a creature of pure shadow and emerald eyes. It was her companion, the one named in the denunciation. It did not run. It placed itself between Elsa and the guards, its back arched, its fur standing on end. A low, guttural hiss erupted from the small animal, a sound of pure fury and defiance. It was a pathetic defense against the armed men, against the unmovable will of the Inquisitor, but it was a defense nonetheless. For a moment, the guards paused, startled by the tiny, valiant protector. Conrad's gaze fell upon the cat, and his lips thinned into what might have been the ghost of a smile. It was a confirmation, another piece of the truth he had already constructed. The beast had revealed itself. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod to the guards. As they lunged to drag Elsa away, the cat darted sideways. It was too quick for them, a blur of black fur that shot across the square. It did not flee the town but vanished into the dark mouth of a narrow alleyway, escaping the fate of being burned alongside its mistress, a living embodiment of the charge against her. They dragged the terrified woman across the square. Her feet stumbled on the uneven stones. She did not scream or fight, a profound shock had stolen her voice and her strength. Her mind could not grasp the impossible speed of her ruin, from respected healer to condemned witch in the space of a single heartbeat. Her destination was the town hall. Its solid, familiar facade now seemed menacing. They did not take her through the main doors, but around to a small, iron-bound door that led to the cellars. The space, once used for storing wine and records, had been hastily repurposed into a dungeon. The heavy door was pulled open, revealing a set of steep stone steps descending into a cold, damp darkness. A foul smell, of stale air and misery, wafted up to meet them. This was the place where Conrad's truth would be extracted, where a confession would be forged in the crucible of despair. They shoved her through the doorway and down the first few steps. She fell to her knees on the rough stone, the impact jarring her back to the horrific reality of her situation. She looked back up into the gray light of the square one last time before the heavy oak and iron door slammed shut, plunging her into absolute darkness and silencing her silent pleas. For a week, the town ceased to live. It merely existed, trapped in a state of suspended animation. Fear was the air, the water, and the bread. The normal rhythms of work and rest dissolved. People moved only when necessary, their faces blank masks of anxiety, their conversations reduced to fearful, essential whispers. The focal point of this paralysis was the cellar of the town hall. It had become a wound in the center of the town, from which a slow poison seeped. At first, there had been sounds, faint, muffled cries of protest that were quickly swallowed by the stone. Then, as the days passed, these gave way to a different sound, a low, keening wail that was more animal than human. By the fourth day, even that sound had mostly faded. It was replaced by something worse, a profound silence that was punctuated by the occasional, sharp cry of pure agony. This was the sound that haunted the nights and made the days unbearable. The town did not need to see the torment, they heard it in their souls. They listened, and they prayed it would not be their turn next. Down in the cold and the absolute dark, Elsa's world had shrunk to the size of her cell. Time had lost all meaning, marked only by the chilling of the stone floor and the gnawing emptiness in her stomach. The first day, she had clung to her indignation, to the sheer, impossible wrongness of it all. This was a mistake. They would realize who she was. They would let her go. But no one came to let her go. The only visitor was him. Conrad did not need instruments of torture, his presence was the instrument. Each day, the heavy bar on the door would scrape back, and the door would swing open on groaning hinges, admitting a sliver of light from a single lantern. And in that light, his tall, skeletal frame would appear, a specter of judgment. He never raised his voice. He would place the lantern on the floor, the light casting huge, dancing shadows that turned the small cell into a cavern of horrors. He would sit on a small stool, just outside her reach, and he would begin to speak. His voice was a quiet, insidious rustle, more terrifying than any shout, for it was the voice of inescapable reason. He did not accuse her of malice. Instead, he spoke to her of pity. He described her as a vessel, an unknowing chalice that the devil had filled with his poison. Her healing arts, he explained, were the devil's most clever trick. By mimicking God's miracles, the fiend had ensnared her soul, using her hands to do his work under the guise of charity. Conrad was not looking for proof, he was offering a cure. He spoke of the eternal soul, a thing of pure light trapped within her sinful, temporary flesh. He painted a vivid picture of hell, not with fire and brimstone, but with the chilling, endless absence of God. It was an eternity of cold and loneliness, a fate she was already sealing with her stubborn silence. Then he would speak of the flame. The pyre, he explained in his calm, pastoral tone, was not a punishment. It was a sacrament. It was the harsh but loving hand of God reaching down to burn away the corruption of the flesh, to liberate the soul so it could fly to heaven, cleansed and pure. It was a gift, he said, that only a true confession could unlock. He would leave a crust of stale bread and a cup of brackish water, just enough to keep the failing machine of her body operational. Then he would depart, plunging her back into the profound, sensory deprivation of the darkness. In that void, his words would echo, take root, and begin to grow like poisonous weeds in her exhausted mind. Hunger and thirst became her constant companions, a dull, aching reality that clouded all thought. Sleep was a flighty, terrified creature that would not come. When it did, it brought nightmares, not of demons, but of Conrad's face, his icy eyes, his voice whispering of the cleansing flame. She would wake with a scream trapped in her raw throat. He began to weave her own life into his narrative of sin. He would ask about her late husband. Had he died suddenly? Perhaps a poison, learned from her dark master, had been administered. He asked about her garden. Did the herbs grow too well, unnaturally vibrant? This was surely the result of a pact, the soil enriched by infernal power. He spoke of her cat. The creature was not a pet, he insisted, but a familiar, a lesser demon sent to be her guide and confidant. He asked her to recall their conversations. At first, she denied it, horrified. But in the dark, her memories began to shift and warp. Had she not spoken to the cat when she was lonely? Had it not seemed to understand? The line between reality and suggestion started to dissolve. The darkness in the cell was no longer empty, it began to teem with the shapes his words had given it. The drip of water from the ceiling began to sound like whispers in a language she almost understood. Her own memories became suspect, tainted by his relentless logic. She remembered gathering herbs under a full moon, for that was when their properties were strongest. He transformed that simple act of folk wisdom into a witch's Sabbath. He described the feel of the broomstick between her legs, the rush of the cold night air, the obscene rites performed in a hidden clearing. He described it so vividly that she began to see it too. Her mind, starved of light and hope, began to betray her. It sought to make sense of her suffering, and the only explanation available was the one Conrad provided daily. The idea of her own innocence became a heavier burden than the lie he offered. Innocence meant this torment was meaningless. Guilt, however, gave it a purpose. It was a path to an ending. By the 7th day, she was a ghost of herself, a frail bundle of rags and bones on the damp straw. Her defiance was gone, eroded away by the constant, dripping poison of his words. She was lost in a labyrinth he had built inside her own skull, and every wall was a mirror reflecting a witch's face. When he came that day, she did not flinch from the light. She looked up at him with hollow, vacant eyes. He began to speak, but she interrupted him, her voice a dry, rasping whisper. She began to tell him what he wanted to hear. She spoke of the black cat, of the pact she had signed in her own blood, of the faces she had seen in the fire. She was not confessing. She was reciting. She was repeating the stories he had planted in her mind, offering them back to him as proof of his victory. And as the fiction tumbled from her lips, she felt a strange, terrifying sense of relief. The truth no longer mattered. Only the end of the pain had any meaning at all. On the 8th day, the final barrier in Elsa's mind crumbled into dust. She was a ruin, a hollowed-out structure where a person once lived. With a scribe summoned to witness the moment, his face pale and his hand trembling, she gave Conrad what he had spent a week constructing. The confession was not a torrent, but a slow, dry trickle of words from a parched soul. She spoke in a monotone, a dead voice from the depths of the cellar's darkness. She recounted the night flights, the wind screaming in her ears, the moon a sickly eye below her. Her descriptions were vivid, filled with the precise details Conrad himself had fed her, now regurgitated as her own memory, her own truth. She described the pact, the pricking of her finger with a thorn, and the signing of her name in a great, heavy book bound in human skin. She named the demon who had been her dark consort, giving him the form and the voice that the Inquisitor had so carefully painted for her in the suffocating blackness of her cell. The scribe's quill scratched frantically across the parchment, a small, insectal sound in the profound silence between her phrases. He did not dare to look at her, keeping his eyes fixed on his work. He was not a scribe, he was an undertaker, dutifully recording the dimensions of a coffin for a soul that was already dead. Her words moved on to the petty evils required of her station. She confessed to souring the milk of her envious neighbor, to causing the baker's bread to never rise, and to whispering a blight into the ear of the burgomaster's prize sow. Each lie was another nail, another splinter of wood for the pyre that awaited her. When it was over, the scroll was long. It was a comprehensive catalogue of sin, a testament to the Inquisitor's patient artistry. Conrad took the parchment and read it over, his thin lips betraying no emotion. He gave a single, curt nod. The scribe, dismissed, scrambled up the steps and back into the light, gasping for air as if he had just escaped a tomb. Outside, the town had been preparing for this moment since dawn. The sounds of hammers and saws had echoed through the square, a grim and industrious percussion. Under the watchful eyes of Conrad's riders, a team of men had built the pyre. It was not a haphazard pile, but a carefully engineered structure of logs and kindling. It stood in the very center of the square, a monstrous, wooden throne raised on a platform for all to see. A thick, upright post was set firmly in its heart. The raw, clean scent of the freshly split timber filled the air, a scent of forests and life that was about to be grotesquely corrupted by the smell of burning flesh. As noon approached, the town guards moved through the streets, their halberds rapping on every door. It was not an invitation. It was a command. All were to bear witness. To refuse would be to show sympathy for the witch, an act that would draw the Inquisitor's gaze. So they came, their faces ashen, their feet dragging. They filled the square, a silent, captive audience. They stood in the shadows of the very buildings where they had lived their lives alongside the woman they were about to watch die. They looked at their feet, at the sky, at anything but the obscene wooden structure that dominated their view. They were complicit in their silence. Then, the cellar door was thrown open. A rectangle of harsh, gray light stabbed into the darkness. Elsa was brought up into the world. The townsfolk let out a collective, involuntary gasp. The woman who emerged was not the Elsa they had known. She was a scarecrow assembled from skin and bone, animated by some final, lingering flicker of life. Her hair, once neatly braided, was a matted tangle of filth and straw. Her dress was a collection of rags hanging from her skeletal frame. Her feet were bare and bleeding. But it was her eyes that caused the people to shrink back. They were wide, unfocused, and utterly empty, as if the soul behind them had already fled. 2 guards held her by the arms, though she offered no resistance. She was weightless, a bundle of dry sticks. They began to lead her on the short, final journey across the cobblestones to the pyre. She moved with a shuffling, stumbling gait, her head lolling on her thin neck. Her vacant eyes slid across the crowd of familiar faces without a single spark of recognition. She saw the blacksmith's wife, who had once brought her a child burning with fever. She saw the old farmer from whom she bought her milk. They were shapes, no more real to her than the nightmares that had been her only companions for a week. Conrad von Marburg was already there, standing beside the pyre like a priest at an altar. He was a pillar of black cloth and unbending will. His face was serene, composed. This was the culmination of his work, the moment of purification, the final, perfect note in his symphony of faith and fear. They reached the platform. The guards, their faces grim and sweaty, half lifted, half dragged her up the few steps and pushed her against the central post. One of them began to tie her to it with thick, coarse rope, his movements clumsy. She did not flinch or cry out. She seemed not to feel the bite of the rope against her raw skin. When she was secured, she hung from the post, her body limp. The guard finished his work and scrambled down from the pyre, wiping his hands on his tunic as if to cleanse them of the deed. A profound and terrible silence descended upon the square. The only sound was the flutter of a banner on the town hall in a sudden, cold breeze. Conrad stepped forward. In his hand, he held the parchment, her confession, her death sentence. He raised his other hand, not for silence, for he already commanded it, but as a signal that the final act was about to begin. Every eye was fixed upon him, every breath held in 1,000 aching chests. He unrolled the scroll with a dry crackle that sounded like a gunshot in the stillness. His voice, when he began to speak, was not loud, but it was clear and cold and carried to every corner of the square. He began to read the list of her heresies, the litany of sins she had so dutifully recited for him in the dark. Conrad's voice droned on, a cold litany of fabricated sins. Each word was a stone, meticulously placed upon the growing cairn of Elsa's guilt. The crowd listened, their faces a sea of pale, upturned masks. They were hypnotized by the sheer, methodical certainty of the Inquisitor's pronouncements, the ritualistic stripping away of a human life. He was nearing the end of the long scroll, the part where the Church, having done its work of extraction and condemnation, would piously wash its hands of the blood to come. He read the words that would officially release the broken woman to the temporal powers, the legal fiction that would allow the burgomaster's guards to light the torch. And so, with her soul's corruption made manifest by her own tongue, we deliver this vessel of iniquity into the hands of the secular authorities for the timely execution of justice. He intoned, his voice unwavering. It was at this precise, procedural moment that the world tore open. A blur of absolute black erupted from the mouth of an alley. It moved with an unnatural speed, a living shadow that streaked across the cobblestones. It was a missile of pure night, silent and aimed. The guards, mesmerized by the ceremony, saw it too late. It shot between their legs before they could even lower their pikes. It was the cat. Elsa's cat. The creature whose existence had been offered as proof of her guilt. It did not cry out or hesitate. With a single, impossible leap, it landed silently atop the carefully stacked logs of the pyre, just feet from Elsa's bound and bleeding ankles. It paid no mind to its former mistress. Instead, it faced the Inquisitor. Its back arched into a perfect, taut bow, its fur bristling like charred thorns. From its throat came a sound that did not belong in the world of men, a low, guttural hiss that was part serpent, part tearing cloth, filled with an ancient and chilling hatred. Conrad stopped reading. The words died in his throat. This was the first unplanned event since his arrival, the first crack in his perfect, hermetic control. For a single, frozen beat, the Inquisitor, the condemned, the guards, and the entire town were held captive by the furious gaze of the small, black animal. His icy eyes narrowed, not in surprise, but in a kind of cold, predatory recognition. It was as if he had been waiting for this sign, this final piece of a puzzle only he could see. He slowly, deliberately, lowered the parchment that held Elsa's fate, letting it curl in on itself. The sentence was forgotten. The crowd held its breath. A wave of confusion and a new, sharper fear rippled through them. What was this? A trick? A demonic intervention? They watched the Inquisitor, trying to read his granite face, but it offered them nothing. He simply stared at the hissing creature. Then, he moved. But his movement was a shocking misdirection. He turned his head away from the pyre, away from the confessed witch and her demonic familiar. His gaze swept over the crowd and came to rest on the stone steps of the town hall, where the town's leadership stood as witnesses. His long, skeletal finger, the same one that had pointed at Elsa in the market, rose again. But this time, it did not point at the woman tied to the stake. It aimed directly at the portly, sweating figure of the burgomaster, a man whose face was a mask of bewildered self-importance. A gasp went through the crowd like a scythe. The burgomaster blinked, his mouth falling slightly open. He looked to his left and right, as if the finger must be pointing at someone behind him. But there was no one. The Inquisitor's accusatory digit was fixed solely on him. Conrad's voice returned, but it was different now. The monotonous, procedural tone was gone, replaced by a chilling resonance that cut through the silence like a shard of ice. There, he boomed, his voice seeming to come from the sky itself. There is the true root of this town's corruption. You accuse this woman, he continued, gesturing dismissively toward the pyre without looking at it, this pathetic, deluded vessel. But she is merely a symptom. Her weakness was but a door for a much greater evil to enter. An evil that stands among you, cloaked in authority. The burgomaster's face had gone from confusion to a blotchy, terrified red. He began to stammer, to raise a trembling hand in protest, but no words would come. He was a man of ordinances and taxes, of measured civic power. He had no defense against a hurricane of pure, divine accusation. It was you. Conrad's voice thundered, striking the man like a physical blow. You who knelt in the dark places. You who fed your ambition with the worship of an ancient filth that slithered here long before the first stone of that church was laid. You are the high priest of this town's damnation. He took a step forward, his eyes burning with a zealot's fire. The fall of crows was no witch's trick. It was a summoning. A ritual of power you performed, using a cursed artifact you keep hidden within the walls of your own town hall, to solidify your pathetic grasp on this blighted land. The accusation was so monstrous, so specific and insane, that no one could process it. It recontextualized everything. The omen, the silence, the fear, it had all been a lie, a distraction from a deeper rot. The guards looked from the Inquisitor to their master, their faces slack with shock. Conrad made a sharp, impatient gesture with his hand, a flick of his wrist that held all the authority of a king. It was not a request. It was an order that bypassed all channels of secular power, aimed directly at the core of their fear. Seize him. Seize the heretic. For a heartbeat, the guards hesitated, their loyalty caught in a terrible schism. But the fear of the Inquisitor was a far more immediate and potent force than their allegiance to the sputtering burgomaster. With a clatter of armor, they turned and lunged up the steps of the town hall. The burgomaster let out a squeal of terror as their rough hands grabbed his velvet robes. His protests were a garbled, incoherent babble as they dragged him down the steps, his dignity vanishing in an instant. He was no longer a leader, he was just a piece of meat caught in the machine. Conrad did not grant the scene a second glance. He turned his back on the captured men, on the stunned crowd, and on the woman he had just condemned to the fire. Elsa hung from the post, forgotten, a piece of used evidence in a trial that was already over, a ghost at a feast that had moved to another room. With his two dark riders falling into step behind him, Conrad began to walk with a calm, unyielding purpose toward the main doors of the town hall. The source of the contagion lies within, he announced to no one in particular. I will tear it out. At that moment, the black cat, its role in the drama fulfilled, uncoiled. It gave one last, contemptuous look at the chaos it had unleashed. Then, it leaped down from the pyre and darted into the forest of legs in the crowd, vanishing as quickly and as mysteriously as it had appeared. The people of the town were left frozen in a tableau of utter horror. Their eyes darted from their terrified, struggling leader being dragged toward the very same cellar that had broken Elsa, to the impassive back of the Inquisitor disappearing into the seat of their government, and then back to the pyre. And there hung Elsa, limp and silent, her empty eyes staring at a world that no longer saw her. She was a sacrifice, not to God, but to a purpose so vast and so cold that it was beyond their comprehension. Her suffering had been a mere prelude, a key used to unlock a much larger, darker door.